Podcasts. They're everywhere. They're like roaches. They keep replicating, and if you see one, there's like a million of them living inside your walls. Anyway, you get my point. In the past 10 years or so, comedians have really weaponized the podcast medium in an attempt to bolster their ticket sales and hopefully grow their audience. And at first, there were some classic podcasts by comics who had interesting ideas who went on to grow in popularity. They were filling a space in the podcast market that was vastly underserved. But now that market is flooded with oceans of mid-tier comics who sit around and talk about nothing. It's rarely funny, and the cushy ad revenue from the same 6 sponsors incentivizes them to keep pumping out more. So stick around as I discuss the comedy podcast epidemic. This is Dancing with Ghosts. Ah, yes, the modern Mount Rushmore of podcast comics that flood my YouTube feed daily. The aw shucks y'all hillbilly Theo Vaughn, the king of all dads Tom Segura, the confrontation avoidant cuck Bobby Lee, and probably the most egregious to my eyes and ears, the shirtless slob Bert Kreischer. This incestuous pool of comics not only all have their own podcasts, but also frequently appear on each other's podcasts, completely ruining any kind of novelty that collaborations are supposed to bring. Joe Rogan is to blame for spawning most of these offshoots, seeing as many of them got their big break from being on Rogan's podcast early on, before it became the national institution it is today. Joe Rogan, being the ever-loyal alpha male that he is, has rewarded their allegiances by continually featuring them on his show that has gone on to garner millions of listeners. But let's step back for a second. Before I start critiquing all of these mid-level comedian podcasters, let me point out some of those classic comedy podcasts I mentioned earlier. The first comedy podcast I began regularly listening to over 10 years ago was the rambling attention deficit Bill Burr with his Monday morning podcast. Even though Bill has sold out long ago and now produces toothless, inoffensive garbage, unless you're a sports fan or helicopter pilot, for the first at least 7 years, Bill put out weekly funny material that didn't rely on a sidekick. Bill's almost schizophrenic ability to talk to himself for at least an hour every week and have it be funny is quite the impressive feat, and it's a talent 90% of comics don't possess. Even though recently it's just basically been Bill commenting on sports games, which is PC enough for him not to have to go on an apology tour. Then of course you had Mark Maron's WTF podcast, where he interviewed his comedy friends, and then eventually the President of the United States. Every episode was a new experience, and you didn't really have to be a long-time listener to jump right in. Joe Rogan had a similar format in the sense of having guests, but the conversations were more stream of consciousness and less of an interview style. Plus, Rogan didn't ask every single guest to go in-depth about their childhood the way that Mark Maron would. Thank God. Rogan's podcast also very much had the macho bro energy that appealed to a lot of other bros and wannabe edgelords. The edgy comments and vigor of early Rogan have definitely faded over time, given the ever more politically correct cancel climate that Joe has to abide by to please his corporate masters at Spotify. Fast forward to today, and the comedy podcast tumor has metastasized into a full-grown cancer in the comedy community. There are so many comedy podcasts now that it's no longer a novel idea. Why try to innovate when Tiger Belly and Your Mom's House is pulling in thousands in ad revenue with people just sitting in comfortable chairs gossiping? The typical premise of the modern day comedy podcast is this: a group of B or C tier comics think that they are just so interesting and funny that they don't need a hook. They don't need to be quick on their feet with wittiness. Just give them a Shure SM7B microphone and let the hilarity ensue. Also, with these types of podcasts, you kind of have to be a dedicated listener to even understand most of the inside jokes or what's going on with these people's lives. But don't worry, if the weekly podcasts aren't enough content for you, these comics are also getting Netflix specials as well. Which, I guess isn't really saying anything, pretty much as Netflix will give a special to just about anyone unless your name is Brandon Schaub. I don't know. I used to be really into watching stand-up and even attempted to do it when I was younger. I was alright. I kind of sucked. The comics I looked up to were guys like David Cross, Patton Oswalt, Todd Barry, Dave Attell, Dave Chappelle, Brian Regan, Doug Stanhope, and Chris Rock. The level of comedy from the older generation just seemed to pack more of a punch and didn't rely on hack premises like, I'm the out-of-shape fat guy who likes jerking off, which I feel like is easily a great stock premise for many of the comics who have Netflix specials now. And I don't even feel right calling these podcast comics the next generation of stand-up, because all of these dudes are like in their 40s. They just didn't blow up until later in life after discovering the bountiful teat of Joe Rogan. I've heard the name Matt Rife thrown around a lot lately as a young up-and-comer, but most people say, and I've confirmed this by watching it myself, he's a crowd work comedian, which is fucking lazy and not a form of comedy that I've ever enjoyed. Before podcasts, I didn't know every single facet of David Cross's life, and I didn't want to know. And I don't think my favorite comics wanted me to know every aspect of their lives either. But more importantly, I didn't hear my favorite comics be unfunny, because the only time I'd hear from them is when they had a new special out and it was truly exciting. Now, when you see a new comedy special, you've already been so inundated with content from that comedian that it's not nearly as impactful. It might just be me, but comedy was just so much more special when you didn't get this all-access pass to your favorite comics and their personal lives. Then there's the stupid drama. Eventually, after pumping out so much material, these guys will start to get a little too personal with each other, and drama will eventually ensue. There's no better example than when, for instance, Brandon Schaub went on the Tiger Belly podcast with Bobby Lee and was accused of hitting on Bobby Lee's wife, Kalua, whatever her name is. Or when Burt was upset that Bobby Lee didn't want to go on tour with him, mainly because Bobby Lee wanted to avoid Burt Kreischer and his crazy debauched partying every single night, probably.
It's been hard, dude.
Thermostat beef.
Thermostat. What?
We need to change subjects.
Why?
Keep going. What else is going on then?
Have I blown your mind?
No, it's. I would. Yeah, I don't know. I can't really talk, man. That's the thing.
Then you also had the time when Ari Shaffir roofied Burt Kreischer's drink during some dinner that Ari was having at Bert's house.
Let's start with Ari slipping me Molly.
What?
Let's start there.
You slipped him on?
Yeah.
Dude, what are you doing? What are you doing? How much?
It's enough.
Interesting. How did you do it? Where was this?
It was at his house.
It was
at
at my house in
podcast.
front of my children.
Oh.
We had a shot
in a
before.
safe
We had a
place.
shot before we started. I had to empty out a capsule and fucking put it into a shot.
Are you out of your mind? Are you out of your mind?
Yeah.
And I know people eat this shit up online, but it's turning into this cheap reality TV. Like, come on, man, give me a break. And you could say, well, just don't watch it. Well, it's hard to avoid because YouTube has decided it's such compelling content, it needs to be in all of my recommended feeds. It's like back when MTV had a shred of relevance remaining and all they would air were those shitty reality TV shows, and I watched it. Because I believed in the initial goal of MTV as music television. Until one day I realized, oh wait, they don't give a shit about music anymore. They're just trying to make the laziest, cheapest entertainment to bring in the most ad revenue. Comedy podcast! The average consumer may view this as a golden age in comedy, but I view it as a dark age of mundane, throwaway content that takes away from the art form. I've always said this, and I will still say it to this day, stand-up comedy is the most truest art form because you know immediately if people like you or not. They either laugh or they don't. People may politely clap after a singer-songwriter plays their shitty song at a cafe, but nobody fake laughs at an open mic. I guess my concern is that younger people watching all these lackluster podcasts are going to think that sitting around and talking to your friends is all it takes to be a comedian. And I'm not saying all these comics that I've mentioned in this video don't put work into the acts, don't get it twisted. But people consuming their lackluster podcasts may not understand the behind-the-scenes work ethic of it, and it kind of poisons the well. I mean, how many times have either you heard yourself or someone around you say something to the effect of,
oh my god, we are so funny. Our sense of humor is so twisted. We should totally start a podcast.
yeah, 95% of those people should definitely never start a podcast. A note from the editor, you might have heard me say a podcast and thought that was a mistake. I'm actually referring to something that was similar to 1980s apartheid in Africa, except for it was recorded. That's what a podcast is. I did not mess up. Look, I understand the reason why having a podcast is smart. It's a low risk, low cost way of potentially attracting an audience. The problem with all of that is just what I said. It inspires people who truly have no business talking into a microphone to give podcasting a try. And when that happens, the market becomes terminally oversaturated, thereby burying those few podcasts that might have actually been funny and might have actually been worth listening to. I don't know. What do you think? I know most people watching this video are fans of at least one of the podcasters that I threw some shade on, so let me know how wrong I am in the comments section below. Honestly, I think East Coast comedy is where it's at now. The LA comics are played out. They are played out. Their podcasts are played out. Feel like the East Coast guys are still not afraid of taking risks, taking chances. I'm not even going to name names because I don't want anyone to call me out on anything. So anyway, that's my last hot take, I promise. Let me know what you think about all this. Until next time, have a good rest of your night.